In this fragment, I want to look at an essay by H.P. Lovecraft called Supernatural Horror in Literature from 1927. There's probably a dozen or so essays on literature which a person should know if they want to be an educated man. I mean, Samuel Johnson's Preface to Shakespeare, T.S. Eliot's Tradition and the Individual Talent, maybe J.R.R. Tolkien's on fairy stories are examples of this. These are perennial works, meaning these are works that you can read at any time or place for both pleasure and profit. But while there are perennial works that you should know, there are also works which are what you might call seasonal works, works which are particularly apt for a certain era or time. And I think the Lovecraft essay on supernatural horror is one of these seasonal works. It's a work which the title of this video suggests is a work suited to civilizational winter. Now, to illustrate the mood of Lovecraft's essay and the sense of civilizational winter that I'm thinking of here, um, I want to point back to the sonnet by Edgar Allan Poe, Sonnet to Science. I think this poem offers a fine illustration of the sense of a disenchanted world that I associate with the sense of civilizational winter that I'm thinking of. This poem comes almost exactly a century before the Lovecraft work, Sonnet to Science. Science, true daughter of old time thou art, who alterest all things with thy peering eyes. Why preyest thou thus upon the poet's heart, vulture, whose wings are dull realities? How should he love thee? Or how deem thee wise, who wouldst not leave him in his wandering to seek for treasure in the jeweled skies, albeit he soared with an undaunted wing? Hast thou not dragged Diana from her car, and driven the Hamadryad from the wood, to seek a shelter in some happier star? Hast thou not torn the Naiad from her flood, the Elfin from the green grass, and from me, the summer dream, beneath the tamarind tree? That is this idea of a world that has been disenchanted by science, let's say materialism, and you can see it in the references to Diana, the gods and deities of old, or even just magical beings like elves, but also from the poet himself, a sense of a summer dream. The world of science, and I don't think I can stress this enough, the world view that is most conducive to applying the methodology that is science is just not does not really offer much to sway the human heart. It never has, and probably never will. And in Poe's poem, where he addresses science as if it was a mistress, um, it he likewise seems unwooed by science, and yet, of course, by the 1820s and certainly by the 1920s, when Lovecraft is writing, science is also kind of undeniable as a massive force in human culture. But it's a force that disenchants, that turns the world that is sort of suited to the human heart to a different kind of world. Well, between Poe's writing and Lovecraft's writing, something happens. The disenchantment becomes more civilizational. It becomes a disenchantment of a different civilizational period, of a winter period, because I think that World War One really is kind of the death knell of the autumnal era, and it's inaugurating an era in which we now live, the civilizational winter era. Poe is sensing this. The Romantics sensed this. They also were dissatisfied by the, let's say, the disenchantment, the scientific worldview. But it was believed for a long time that, and certainly the Romantics believed this, that, well, liberalism, democracy, leftism, progressive politics could solve the problem of modernity, that the problem of modernity could be solved by sweeping away the old traditions that held people back, the old superstitions. This is the idea that you see in various ways in people like Locke, in people like Spinoza, people like Rousseau, in the Enlightenment more generally. But with Nietzsche, you start to see an awareness among some, it's just very few in his time, but progressively more and more, a sense that that's not going to get the job done. That political solution, the Enlightenment solution, is not going to be a solution. It's not going to work. And that sense after World War One, or during World War One, certainly, and then also after, that sense becomes more widespread, and the sense of a disenchanted world becomes more apocalyptic. And that more apocalyptic sense is something captured by the poet William Butler Yeats in his 1919 poem, The Second Coming. Well, let's take a look at that. Now, this poem, lines from this poem are often referenced by people. It just is one of those, it captures something that people turn back to over and over again. Turning and turning in the widening gyre, the falcon cannot hear the falconer. Things fall apart. The center cannot hold. Mere anarchy is loosed upon the world. The blood-dimmed tide is loosed, and everywhere the ceremony of innocence is drowned. The best lack all conviction, while the worst are full of passionate intensity. Surely some revelation is at hand. Surely the second coming is at hand. The second coming. Hardly are those words out, when a vast image out of Spiritus Mundi troubles my sight. Somewhere in sands of the desert, a shape with lion body and the head of a man, a gaze blank and pitiless as the sun, is moving its slow thighs, while all about it reel shadows of the indignant desert birds. The darkness drops again, but now I know that 20 centuries of stony sleep were vexed to nightmare by a rocking cradle. And what rough beast, its hour come round at last, slouches toward Bethlehem to be born? You can see that there's a sense of a possible re-enchantment of the world. But this is a re-enchantment that seems to be a vision of somewhat of horror. It's a rough beast slouching towards Bethlehem to be born. It's not a positive vision, but it is a sense of some new thing might be coming. And this poem comes less than a decade before Lovecraft's essay that we're going to look at. So, in a way, it's forming part of the cultural context in which Lovecraft is working. And that cultural context is one of an awareness of, let's say, civilizational winter, certainly on the parts of certain artists, and a response to that. I think that what Lovecraft is doing in his essay is attempting to identify. So, on the surface, he's just identifying a literary form, the form of supernatural horror. But what he's also doing is identifying a form that is appropriate to these times, and a form in which perhaps people can reach forward towards a new kind of myth making, or towards a kind of myth making that is necessary in a time of a disenchanted world, a world in which the former belief in progress is now falling apart. And, well, let's just look at the essay and see how he treats this era. He's not just describing a literary form, but he's also trying to point the way towards a new kind of myth making, perhaps describe a kind of fiction which can operate in an era such as ours, a kind of fiction which should operate in an era such as ours. Well, let's look at what he says. The oldest and strongest emotion of mankind is fear. And the oldest and strongest kind of fear is fear of the unknown. These facts few psychologists will dispute, and their admitted truth must establish for all time the genuineness and dignity of the weirdly horrible tale as a literary form. Against it are discharged all the shafts of a materialistic sophistication which clings to frequently felt emotions and external events, and of a naively insipid idealism which deprecates the aesthetic motive and calls for a didactic literature to uplift the reader toward a suitable degree of smirking optimism. Now, let me just pause for a moment that and suggest that I think in our contemporary era, there is a similar demand, and it's the demand of the current form of this naively insipid idealism towards this didactic literature is woke literature, basically. Um, it's didactic in its own way, not in the same way as it was in Lovecraft's time, but it's the same thing that he's responding to, right? It's trying to say, no, well, we're a sophisticated people, we're a materialistic people, and what we need is literature that can help us rise up towards this ideal, better world that we're going to be creating. And Lovecraft's responding against that kind of literature, which I think people want to respond against even now. And he goes on to say, in spite of all this opposition, the weird tale has survived, developed, and attained remarkable heights of perfection, founded as it is on a profound and elementary principle whose appeal, if not always universal, must necessarily be poignant and permanent to minds of the requisite sensitiveness. Now, another thing that you notice in Lovecraft is part of his presenting a kind of literature that is a counterweight to the prevailing one is he has a very aristocratic sensibility. He isn't trying to shoot for something that's going to be wildly popular or the most popular. No, he insists that, at all times it's going to be something that appeals to a certain kind of person, minds of the requisite sensitiveness. And this aristocratic sensibility you'll find throughout. The appeal of the spectrally macabre is generally narrow because it demands from the reader a certain degree of imagination and a capacity for detachment from everyday life. Relatively few are free enough from the spell of the daily routine to respond to rappings from outside and tales of ordinary feelings and events, or of common sentimental distortions of such feelings and events, will always take first place in the taste of the majority. Rightly, perhaps, since of course these ordinary matters make up the greater part of human experience. But the sensitive are always with us, and sometimes a curious streak of fancy invades an obscure corner of the very hardest head, so that no amount of rationalization, reform, or Freudian analysis can quite annul the thrill of the chimney corner whisper or the lonely wood. Okay, so this even the very hardest head sometimes is going to be struck by the appeal that this kind of literature makes. And indeed, you find that even among the sort of woke writers of today, there is an attraction towards Lovecraft, even though he's a racist and a probably a sexist, and all the other bad things, they still are drawn to his writing because even in their very hardest of heads, there is a sense in which his fancies still enter in. And rationalization. Okay, there's that sense of our more scientific and highly rational worldview. Reform, again, that's a reference to this belief in political utopianism or liberalism or progressivism as the answer to the disenchanted world. Well, we're going to re-enchant the world by creating an ideal. We're going to create utopia on Earth. That's what reform is pointing towards. In Freudian analysis, so in 1927, what he's saying is like even the most current scientific explanation for the movements of the human mind, even that is not, it doesn't really just explain away these feelings that people have when they read weird stories. And those feelings are going to be with us, he suggests, uh, probably forever. There is here involved a psychological pattern or tradition as real and as deeply grounded in mental experience as any other pattern or tradition of mankind, coeval with the religious feeling and closely related to many aspects of it, and too much a part of our inmost biological heritage to lose keen potency over a very important, though not numerically great, minority of our species. Okay, so now this is interesting because while Lovecraft is not really all that religious himself, the sense of the feelings that the weird story evokes are related to the religious sense, right? Because there is a sense of transcendence involved. And that's part of his concept of cosmic horror. Is it is a way of trying to shoehorn back into our life and our experience and our imaginations an appreciation for the transcendent, which is why even religious persons should find some value in Lovecraft, even though he's not necessarily a believer. He is at least useful for believers and somewhat allied to them because the emotions he preys on, the emotions he appeals to, are emotions that are related to the religious feeling. Okay, they are connected. So another way of putting this would be to say that Lovecraft wants to find the summer dream under the tamarind tree again. The summer dream which reason, reform, i.e., political progressivism, or Freudian analysis, i.e., scientific explanation of the movements of the mind, all the things that disenchant the world, he wants to put back in. And he thinks that through this kind of literature, they can be put back in because it's appealing to some deep part of us that is not touched by science, rationalization, reform, or anything else. So that is why weird fiction is important. And in fact, a little bit later on in the essay, when he's discussing the author Matthew Gregory Lewis and his work The Monk from 1796, he compliments him by saying, "One great thing may be said of the author, that he never ruined his ghostly visions with a natural explanation." So this idea of trying to explain away our feelings of horror by rational explanation, that is for Lovecraft just the kiss of death. It destroys the effect of horror to have it all just be explained away. Um, Part of the horror effect is an effect of something that can't be explained away. That's kind of uncanny. Again, this is related to the religious feeling as well. Some feeling of something transcendent that can't just be explained and done away with through being explained. Let's look in a little more detail at his discussion of the work of Edgar Allan Poe, because it's in Poe that he believes the earlier moves of Gothic fiction and other kinds of spectral literature really attain their form or nature. What Aristotle would have said was their nature. So a little bit later on, Edgar Allan Poe. the first author who has his own section all to himself in this essay. In the 1830s occurred a literary dawn directly affecting not only the history of the weird tale, but that of short fiction as a whole, and indirectly molding the trends and fortunes of a great European aesthetic school. It is our good fortune as Americans to be able to claim that dawn as our own, for it came in the person of our illustrious and unfortunate fellow countryman, Edgar Allan Poe. Poe's fame has been subject to curious undulations, and it is now a fashion amongst the advanced intelligentsia to minimize his importance both as an artist and as an influence. But it would be hard for any mature and reflective critic to deny the tremendous value of his work and the pervasive potency of his mind as an opener of artistic vistas. True, his type of outlook may have been anticipated, but it was he who first realized its possibilities and gave it supreme form and systematic expression. True also that subsequent writers may have produced greater single tales than his, but again, we must comprehend that it was only he who taught them by example and precept the art which they, having the way cleared for them and given an explicit guide, were perhaps able to carry to greater lengths. Whatever his limitations, Poe did that which no one else ever did or could have done, and to him we owe the modern horror story in its final and perfected state. So again, this is that Aristotelian sense of something attaining its nature. And when it attains its nature, there might be better or worse versions of it, but it's not changing in its essential form anymore. What's happening is people are doing variations on that basic nature. And in Aristotle's case, in his Poetics, he looks at tragedy as such a thing which had obtained its nature. And he dismisses, well, he doesn't really look at the earlier examples of it. He just notes that, well, first of all, there was only one speaker, later there was a second, but then later writers learned that you had to add this and this, and now it attained its nature, attained its form, not unlike an acorn growing into a great oak tree. Okay. And in Edgar Allan Poe, that's the first oak tree of the horror of the tale, of the horror tale. And what does attaining its nature mean? Well, this is where he gets into a real fine description of the literature of the Winter Age, the our disenchanted age. And here's what he says about Poe. Before Poe, the bulk of weird writers had worked largely in the dark, without an understanding of the psychological basis of the horror appeal, and hampered by more or less of conformity to certain empty literary conventions, such as the happy ending, virtue rewarded, and in general a hollow moral didacticism, acceptance of popular standards and values, and striving of the author to obtrude his own emotions into the story and take sides with the partisans of the majority's artificial ideas. Again, I can't help but think of the modern equivalent of this in the form of woke narratives, which are not, what are they but hollow moral didacticism, acceptance of popular, although in this case it's not popular, it's just popular among the authors themselves, standards and values, and artificial ideas, that uh, these authors have, and they obtrude their own emotions into them. The whole idea of the Mary Sue, or the character who is just a stand-in for the author, what is that but an obtruding of one's own emotions into the story and taking sides with artificial idea? Well, he is offering Poe as an example of a person who did not do that. Poe, on the other hand, perceived the essential impersonality of the real artist and knew that the function of creative fiction is merely to express and interpret events and sensations as they are, regardless of how they tend or what they prove, good or evil, attractive or repulsive, stimulating or depressing, with the author always acting as a vivid and detached chronicler rather than as a teacher, sympathizer, or vendor of opinion. Okay. So one is not merely teaching a lesson. One is not merely creating something that people are supposed to sympathize with or purchase, you know, you're not just teaching lessons all the time. Okay. You have to learn from the world. He saw clearly that all phases of life and thought are equally eligible as subject matter for the artist, and being inclined by temperament to strangeness and gloom, decided to be the interpreter of those powerful feelings and frequent happenings which attend pain rather than pleasure, decay rather than growth, terror rather than tranquility, and which are fundamentally either adverse or indifferent to the tastes and traditional outward sentiments of mankind, and to the health, sanity, and normal expansive welfare of the species. So, he's admitting that his visions are of those qualities which are not necessarily to our benefit. They're not necessarily good things, but they are real and they are part of our experience and existence. And they also have a beauty of their own, which is not a beauty of pure rationality. And that's what Lovecraft wants to champion in this work. So let's go on a little bit more. Poe's specters thus acquired a convincing malignity possessed by none of their predecessors, and established a new standard of realism in the annals of literary horror. The impersonal and artistic intent, moreover, was aided by a scientific attitude not often found before, whereby Poe studied the human mind rather than the uses of Gothic fiction. Now, this is a very important point, and another one that I think applies very much to the work, the entertainment work of today. And this is one of the big failings of it. So the division of labor seems to have been carried on to such a degree that the people who engage in creating entertainment, especially the writers of it, are people who all they know is writing. They don't have much experience of the world. Their experience is experience of other writings. And so, as Lovecraft puts it here, they are familiar with the usages of fiction, the usages of narrative. They haven't studied the human mind or the human heart. They haven't gone to the source of these things. They haven't gone back to nature, in other words. They're therefore working at a remove from nature. They're working with an understanding, however intelligent that understanding might be. It's an understanding ultimately of artificiality, of worlds and narratives created by humans. And that limits them. That limits them necessarily. And what Lovecraft is saying is that Poe was not limited that way because he went back to nature. He studied the human mind. He worked with, to continue, an analytical knowledge of terror's true sources, which doubled the force of his narratives and emancipated him from all the absurdities inherent in merely conventional shutter coining. So he's not just using jump scares, but he knows the real sources of terror, which at the beginning of this essay, Lovecraft says is fear of the unknown. This example having been set, later authors were naturally forced to conform to it in order to compete at all, so that in this way a definite change began to infect the mainstream of macabre writing. So after Poe, you had to go back to the source in the same way, or your work just wouldn't work. It just wouldn't be effective. Uh, some of the works that he looked at earlier in the essay seem kind of weak and not really scary at all because Poe has happened. Our minds have been shaped by narratives shaped by Poe, and so we realize that these just don't work because they're relying too much on dumb conventions that don't really apply to the true source of terror. Okay, but Poe did, and so his works will retain a certain value, even if he from time to time is not technically adept. And so here's what he says, or here's how he puts that. Poe too set a fashion in consummate craftsmanship, and though today some of his own work seems slightly melodramatic and unsophisticated, we can constantly trace his influence in such things as the maintenance of a single mood and achievement of a single impression in a tale, and the rigorous paring down of incidents to such as have a direct bearing on the plot and will figure prominently in the climax. That seems to be kind of a reference to the Chekhov's gun idea of everything applies to the plot. Everything has some significance and meaning. Truly may it be said that Poe invented the short story in its present form. His elevation of disease, perversity, and decay to the level of artistically expressible themes was likewise infinitely far reaching in effect. For avidly seized, sponsored, and intensified by his eminent French admirer, Charles Pierre Baudelaire, it became the nucleus of the principal aesthetic movements in France, thus making Poe, in a sense, the father of the decadents and the symbolists. Now, I want to emphasize that the kind of literature that Lovecraft is favoring is a literature of horror and terror, but that's just one aspect. Obviously, the most important aspect, certainly the most important in his own work, but not the only aspect, even in Lovecraft's own work. Um, because there's a general sense, I believe, in which he's trying to get a literature that is capable, get to or champion a literature capable of finding enchantment in the world again. And you see a reference to this or you see this when he discusses the work of Algernon Blackwood. So, after discussing the work of Arthur Machen and his short story, The Great God Pan, which is an excellent example of the kind of fiction Lovecraft likes, he goes on to discuss the faults and virtues of the author Algernon Blackwood. And in his analysis, or in his discussion, he says Mr. Blackwood's lesser work is marred by several defects, such as ethical didacticism, occasional insipid whimsicality, the flatness of benignant supernaturalism, and a too free use of the trade jargon of modern occultism. A fault of his more serious efforts is that diffuseness and long windedness which results from an excessively elaborate attempt, under the handicap of a somewhat bald and journalistic style, devoid of intrinsic magic, color, and vitality, to visualize precise sensations and nuances of uncanny suggestion. Okay, so one of the things that he's trying to say here is that the effect of horror and enchanting literature in general is you can't be too precise and you can't be too scientific and elaborate in hinting at things. Um, that's not uncanny. That starts to tend towards scientific realism, and it's not really going to work. But he goes on to say, in spite of all this, the major products of Mr. Blackwood attain a genuinely classic level and evoke, as does nothing else in literature, an awed and convinced sense of the imminence of strange spiritual spheres or entities. That is what I mean by a re-enchantment or an enchantment of things. And that is ultimately what Lovecraft wants to do. And if you read his fiction, I want to encourage people to read not just his quote cosmic horror, which that is mostly what he writes, but he's got a number of other short stories which are really just about traveling in a dream world. Um, and those are interesting short stories as well. And they also show his just overall love for literature of enchantment and of almost any kind, really. And that is a big part of who he is. It's not just, horror stories. I think that's an important detail. So I hope this illustrates Lovecraft's general idea of a literature or of horror and of horror and other literature as perhaps providing a way of re-enchanting the world, of finding a new way of myth making in a time which I think is just very I think is essential to us in a time of civilizational winter. We don't have to necessarily do it through horror. Again, there are other ways, dreams being one. But the rough idea is there. And that idea is one of a dissatisfaction with narrow didacticism, the literature that is favored by our current regime. People will respond against that. There will always be some kind of audience for something that isn't that. And I think that that last line of the essay applies to himself. Who shall declare the dark theme a positive handicap? Radiant with beauty, the cup of the Ptolemies was carven of onyx.